Hello again to another episode of the Real Estate Junkies. My name is Nick Zigic, and today we're going to be talking about a life after transaction from the seller's point of view. So today in the studio with me, my buddy Mike Vachani.
Thank you, Nick.
Two brokers getting together to talk about one exciting thing, and that is when the seller has a buyer, what happens then?
The seller is waiting for this moment.
Yeah.
And they're waiting for that phone call.
Yep.
So when we get the offers in as an agent, what I normally do is I go sit down with the seller, with their family, sit at the table and say, okay, now we're going to make this from going from selling to make it a reality.
Yeah.
This is an emotional time because the seller now is actually locking up their house. When they sign this contract, that means they have no right to cancel the contract under no circumstance per the contract unless the buyer changes their mind or there's another agreement made.
Right.
So
That's
it's
true.
an emotional time.
That's true.
So the first thing is the contract comes in front of the seller. And we've talked about the contract in the past already. The seller is going to review the contract, the basic terms in the contract, the price, what type of financing the buyer is going to be bringing in there, how long the escrow is going to be, and the terms. The terms are who's paying for what.
And having those four mentioned, I need to interrupt you in this because I want to break it down a little bit more. We're not going to go way astray, but
no, please, it's
you
okay.
can have that same scenario into a multi-offer situation.
Yes.
So now we have multiple offers and the same decision making over multiple offers.
And a lot of times you may have 5 offers. In today's market or other previous markets, you may have 5 offers that are all the exact same price.
Yep.
And guess what? All the exact down payment. How do you select?
Oh.
How do you select? And that's a good thing because that's where the agent comes in to help negotiate the deal. So let's go back. Okay. Assuming it's 1 or 10 offers, it's still the same picture. We're looking at the terms of the deal. Who's paying what cost? And we mentioned earlier who's paying what cost. Typically in these deals, the seller pays for all the active termite issues. In other words, getting rid of those little bugs that fly around your house and destroy the wood. The seller pays for that. Okay. The seller pays for the tenting if the house needs to be tented. Okay. The seller pays for...
At what point of time do they actually pay for that?
You know, that's a good question. That's actually done in escrow during what we call the contingency period. Okay. As soon as the buyer removes their contingencies, the seller should take care of the termite work. Okay. They could do it before because no matter who buys it, they're going to ask for that.
They're going to have it
so a lot of times, honestly, what typically happens is when I put the seller into escrow, before they put into escrow, we've already done a termite report. We know what the cost of the work is going to take, what the cost is going to
Well, the seller in that prep thing that we wanted to know what they're selling.
You know, it's something important.
Yeah.
When you get the offer, and you as the seller, make sure your realtor has done a termite report on the property, and you know the cost of termite, because this is not the transaction, but something that always happens is a lot of realtors don't do that in advance. And when you sign your contract and say remove it to escrow, and it says there that seller's paying for all termite, it's an open check. If you have not done the termite report before you sign that contract, you don't know what the sellers you're agreeing to. Just a quick point.
No, that's a good point.
So let's go back to the transaction now.
So it is definitely good to do that within that preliminary process that we talked about?
You should probably do it right when you open up escrow, right when you go into the market.
Exactly.
But a lot of times that's missed. But let's go back to the transaction.
Okay. Point.
So terms, price, who's paying what cost. Typically the seller pays termite. The seller pays their share of the escrow fees. The seller pays for a title policy or title insurance for the owner. And we've talked about that in the past already.
Mm-hmm. That's the seller's obligation. Okay.
Seller's obligation. And the seller typically pays for a home warranty for 1 year, protecting the buyer for simple things that break down. The oven breaks down, the dishwasher breaks down, electrical.
I had a dishwasher within a month replaced.
Standard stuff. That's in the contract. So they review all that stuff.
And I was happy I had it.
I know. You pay a small little fee and you're fixed.
I didn't pay anything as a buyer.
Well, yeah. I mean, when the buyer has an issue.
Right.
So the seller reviews all that with the agent. If there's multiple offers, review all the offers, decide on how they want to counter, and that's when we talk about the price and the terms.
You're talking with the seller, you got all these offers that are similar, or so making the decision on who to expect, that would be a conversation between the agent and the seller, and a very serious one, right?
And
is the agent going to help a lot in that process?
The agent is going to help in that.
Yeah.
You know, the agent's not going to tell the seller what to do. In fact, the agent shouldn't tell the seller what to do. The agent's going to help them understand apples to apples what's on the table. Because purchase price is only one aspect of the whole
Absolutely.
thing. If they have all the same purchase price, that's great. Now the financing. Who is a stronger buyer?
Yep.
The agent is going to qualify those financing. They're going to actually call the lenders and check all that. Maybe you want to check all of them. Maybe you only want to counter 1 or 2 offers. Maybe you want to counter all the offers. The agent's going to do all that based upon your request. So you as a seller have to be smart. You have to be able to compare apples to apples and have the agent make sure you understand apples to apples.
Absolutely.
One other thing I forgot to talk about is in these contracts, another typical item that the seller takes care of is selecting the services, selecting the escrow company, selecting the title company. Not always the home warranty company. You can give that to the buyer because that affects them afterwards.
Right.
But typically the seller selects all that, and typically the agent helps with that because the seller doesn't know A from B. So assuming that happens, you look at the terms, you give the buyer either an acceptance of the offer by signing the contract,
Yes.
or giving them a counteroffer.
Yeah.
And the counteroffer is going to basically say, I want different purchase price, different terms, everything we already talked about.
But that's once you look at him and say, you know, these guys, or even the whole group of multiple offers,
Right.
can receive a counter based on meeting the seller's needs in that particular moment.
Yes.
So one of the key things that I noticed is, you know, little differences when the offers are real close. I had one buyer submit like a personal letter that actually made the deal for them because the seller read this letter and it was the only letter in the pile that says, you know, we're such and such family. We would love to live in this house.
You hit an important topic there, and I did forget to mention that. I mentioned this is a stressful period and very emotional for both sides. Well, the house is very emotional to the seller. Depending on how long they live in the house and how attached they are to the house, selecting the seller doesn't always have to do with, the buyer doesn't always have to do with the contract itself. It's the buyer itself. So the type of buyer, the letter they give there is important. How they prepare the offer from the buyer is very important.
Yep.
And maybe the seller met the buyer during a walkthrough. That's very important. You hit a very important, that emotional aspect.
Ones.
I can tell you from my own example, when I bought my house, there were 20 offers on the table. 20 offers on the table. And they counted all 20 offers. And they counted us all at a much higher price. And immediately, we just accepted everything the way it was as a buyer because we knew it was competitive.
Right.
This is back in 2005. But you know why we got the house? Because we, as the buyer, and we were the buyer in the situation, walked through the house, got to know the seller, and the seller and us built a bond because we had a lot of similarities.
Right.
The wives both did scrapbooking. They both had offices in the house there. The husbands both clicked on a lot of different other items. Yeah. And guess what? That was the reason why we got the house.
That's what it's called, not the highest offer, but the best offer.
And they got the best offer too.
Yeah.
It's the best of both worlds. So going back. Going back, I know we only have limited time here. So let's say the offer gets accepted. Now we go into what's called escrow.
Yep.
And what I mentioned earlier, an escrow period typically is about 30 days. And during this time, the buyer is getting all of their financing in place, and you, the seller, are preparing to sell the house and move. You know, the actual time where you get your money in the end.
Yeah.
The process here is not as complicated as it is for the buyer because the buyer is spending the money. But what you need to expect is that you are going to fill out a lot of disclosures, which you probably already did earlier on in the process, and you're going to give this to the buyer. The buyer is going to sign off on all his disclosures. You're telling everything about the house you can tell.
Yep.
You're going to sit back and wait for the next 10 or 15 days for the buyer to complete all their investigations, for the buyer to accept title, for the buyer to accept the condition of the property, for the buyer to get their lender loan and qualifications complete. You're going to sit and wait. There's not much you're going to do. You're going to sit and wait to the period where the buyer says, I'm ready to move forward.
In your opinion, where does more stress come in the period of waiting for the home inspection to be done and you know, those negotiations, if there is any to be made, or the process of waiting for the financial contingencies to be removed?
A little bit of both. Definitely the financial contingencies and the appraisal, but the home inspection is a big one because the seller knows all the little details in the house that they never touched. And the buyer is doing this inspection, which is very detailed and addresses every little issue. And it gets emotional because the seller gets upset a lot of times from what the buyer requests.
Yeah.
And this is the emotional part of it. The seller does not believe everything the buyer asks for. The buyer is going to over-ask. The seller is going to get defensive. And the agents on both sides, their job is to mediate before it gets to the buyer and seller and make sure both sides understand what's going on. And that's the stressful part.
Yeah.
And that's, I can tell you story after story of issues where the seller just says, let the whole deal go.
If you don't have that mediator to calm everybody down, to get the reasoning going on and whatnot properly, the chances of closing the deal are slim.
The reason why transactions fall through is not just because of issues that can't be resolved. It's because you don't have the right team on both sides being able to negotiate and mediate the issues.
Yep.
The key, because the seller and buyer are going to be emotional. They're going to be irrational. The agents are going to help keep the two sides away from each other. The buyer and seller typically never talk and never meet.
Absolutely.
And when they get a request for repairs, and it could be irrational, it's going to go to the seller. You, as the agent, are going to sit down with the seller and say, okay, let's make sense of this repair for request. They may be asking 100 items. My answer to the seller most times is, instead of addressing all these items, let's give them some type of money credit.
Yeah.
You don't have to fix the stuff. You can say, instead, I'm going to give you $3,000 credit, and what will happen is you'll get this request for repairs from the buyer. It'll come to the seller will review it with the agent and the seller will decide how they want to respond. You could say, no, I do not accept. Yes, I accept with the following exceptions, or in lieu of doing the repairs, I'll give you a cash credit. This goes back to the buyer, and the buyer either accepts or doesn't accept. It goes back and forth.
Yep.
At some point, if they don't accept it, the buyer has to either move forward the way it is or cancel the deal.
Yeah.
And that's all negotiated. Assuming that gets done, you can pass the repairs request, some credits given. The next steps is the financing. And assuming the financing gets done, the seller is going to, at day 10 or 17 or whatever day you agreed, tell buyer, please remove your contingencies. And if the buyer is not doing it, the listing agent is going to say, with a notice to perform, signed by the seller, saying, hey, buyer, you have to remove these contingencies or we cancel the transaction.
We've got to move on.
That's the key.
Yep.
Same with the buyer side. When you hit that removal of contingencies, once that's removed, the stress level on both sides go down, everyone's happy again. This is when the seller starts packing the boxes, getting the moving things set, starts doing everything. The buyer is doing the same thing, the seller is doing the same thing. Yeah. That's when the stress level drops, and then the seller just waits back, does the final paperwork. He's going to sign a bunch of escrow paperwork and sign a grant deed, which a grant deed is a document that's recorded in the recorder's office for the county that says, I, Joe Smith, grant my property to you, Nick, as the buyer. I, seller, am giving it to the buyer. I no longer own the property. This is signed and notarized by the seller, given to escrow. Escrow holds on to it. When escrow receives the money, they take the deed, send it to the recorder's office, and take the money and give it to the buyer, or the seller.
The seller.
And
the money.
And everyone's happy.
Right.
And then the stress levels are gone. Typically, this whole process for buyer or seller, I know we're talking about sellers here, is a stressful, emotional process, but once we get to the end there, it all just becomes relaxed. And the most important part during this transaction is your ally in this whole thing. Whoever you selected as an agent is your ally. That's the person who's going to keep the stress level down. That's the person who's going to answer the questions for you as a seller or the buyer. That's the person that's going to make everything make sense to you.
And I appreciate the way you do it. We have been doing deals together for a long time, and when you kind of handle, when you talk with any of the clients or even prospects, you make sure that they're very comfortable with you, and I appreciate that. I might not be the same way. Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Always.
Thank you.
I'm a real estate junkie.
You are. We are. And I hope that you have learned a whole bunch. If you're a seller in the market that you might be putting your house in the market at some point of time, or you have it in the market, it is very important to understand the process of this deal, because it can be very stressful if you don't. And that's where your agent can help you. I'm Nick Zigic for the Real Estate Junkies. I'll see you next time.